In the spirit of architecture's expansion, there's a great lecture tonight by someone who's redefining what a lecture in an architecture school can be. Mario Gooden, one of our faculty, who will be doing something really beautiful with, in collaboration with Jonathan Gonzalez, an artist.
Interior ring module, endurance. The lost communications came through. Years of basic data, no real surprises. Still looks good. Drawing on a whiteboard, she's coming up fast, with one complication. The planet is much closer to Gargantua than we thought. Gargantua? A very large black hole. And the planet is on the horizon? A basketball around the hoop. Landing there takes us dangerously close. A black hole that big has a huge gravitational pull. It's not that, it's time. That gravity will slow our clock compared to Earth's, drastically. Every hour we spend on that planet will be maybe 7 years back on Earth. That's relativity. How far off the planet do we have to stay to be out of that time shift? Just back from the cusp. So we track a wider orbit of Gargantua, parallel with the planet, but a little further out. Take a ranger down, grab samples, debrief, and analyze back here. Factor in orbit of Gargantua. Minimal thrusting, conserve fuel, but stay in range. Exterior endurance, continuous. Detaches from the ring module. Like an X-1 from a B-29, fires retro thrusters to slow and drops. Exterior, the black hole, Gargantua, day, shoots down towards Gargantua. Exterior black hole, Gargantua, day. A black hole sucking light from the cosmos, visible by its distorting effects on the light of the stars behind it, squeezed into a glowing curved horizon. The endurance approaches. Interior ranger cockpit, day. Looks out at Gargantua, peers over his shoulder. A literal heart of darkness. Cut. Whose Earth is it anyway? If we save the planet and have a society of inequality, we wouldn't have saved much. According to Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They are too narrow and thus assume that people of color have nothing to say about race, gender, sexuality, and the earth, all of which are interconnected. Space and time. An event is something that happens at a particular point in space and at a particular time. So one can specify it by 4 numbers or coordinates. The choice of coordinates is arbitrary. One can use any 3 well-defined spatial coordinates in any measure of time. In relativity, there is no real distinction between the space and time coordinates, just as there is no real difference between any 2 space coordinates. It is often helpful to think of the 4 coordinates of an event as specifying its position in a 4-dimensional space called space-time. But space-time is not flat. It is curved or warped by the distribution of mass and energy in it. The mass of the sun curves space-time in such a way that although the Earth's follows a straight path in four-dimensional space-time, it appears to us to move along a circular orbit in three-dimensional space. Light rays, too, must follow this rule in space-time. The fact that space is curved means that light no longer appears to travel in straight lines in space. So general relativity predicts that light should be bent by gravitational fields. This means that light from a distant star that happened to pass near the sun would be deflected through a small angle, causing that star to appear in a different position to an observer on Earth. Black holes ain't so black. A black hole is a set of events from which it is not possible to escape to a large distance. The boundary of the black hole, the event horizon, is formed by the light rays that just fail to escape from the black hole, hovering just over the edge. It is a bit like running away from the police and just managing to keep one step ahead, but not being able to get clear away. They say our people were born on water. When it occurred, no one can say for certain. Perhaps it was the second week, or the third week, but surely by the fourth, when they had not seen their land or any land for so many days that they lost count. It was after fear had turned to despair, and despair to resignation, and resignation to an embodying understanding. The teal eternity of the Atlantic Ocean had severed them so completely from what had once been their home that it was as if nothing had ever existed before, as if everything and everyone they cherished had simply vanished from the earth. They were no longer Mabundu, or Akan, or Fulani. These men and women from many different nations, all shackled together in the suffocating hull of the ship. They were one people now. 1619 Project. Houston, Challenger Roll Program. Initiation of Vehicle Roll Program. Go, you mother. LVLH. Reminder for cockpit switch, nav configuration change. Local vertical, local horizontal. Hot. Okay, looks like we got a lot of wind here today. Yeah, it's a little hard to see out of my window here. There's 10,000 feet in Mach 0.5. 0.9, there's Mach 1. Going through 19,000. Altitude 19,000 feet. Okay, we're throttling. Throttle up. Throttle up to 104% after maximum dynamic pressure. Throttle up. Roger. Feel that mother go. Woohoo. When Turner exhibited this picture at the Royal Academy in 1840, he paired it with the following extract from his unfinished and unpublished poem, Fallacies of Hope. Aloft all hands. Strike the top mast and belay. Yon angry setting sun and fierce-edged clouds, declare the typhoon's coming. Before it sweeps your decks, throw overboard the dead and dying, ne'er heed their chains. Hope, hope, fallacious hope, where is thy market now? Sakima Jenkins and Company is compelled to present the most astounding and important painting show of the fall art show viewing season. Collectors of fine art will flock to see the latest Kara Walker offerings, And what is she offering but the finest selection of artworks by an African-American living woman artist this side of the Mississippi? Modest collectors will find her prices reasonable. Those of heartier disposition will recognize bargains. Scholars will study and debate the historical value and intellectual merits of Miss Walker's diversionary tactics. Art historians will wonder whether the work represents a departure or a continuum. Students of color will eye her work suspiciously and exercise their free right to culturally annihilate her on social media. Parents will cover the eyes of innocent children. School teachers will re-examine their art history curricula. Prestigious academic academies will withdraw their support. Former husbands and former lovers will recoil in abject terror. Critics will shake their heads in bemused silence. Gallery directors will wring their hands at the sight of throngs of gallery curious flooding the pavement outside. The final President of the United States will visibly wince. Empires will fall, although which ones, only time will tell. No place for pity, no room for fear. In times of dread, artists must never choose to remain silent. Christmas Day, the day after, in 2004, following the presidential re-election of George W. Bush. I'm staring out of my window in an extremely dark mood, feeling helpless. Then a friend, a fellow artist, calls to wish me happy holidays. He asks, "How are you?" And instead of, "Oh, fine, and you?" I blurt out the truth, "Not well." Not only am I depressed, I can't seem to work, to write. It's as though I am paralyzed, unable to write anything more in the novel I've begun. I've never felt this way before, but the election. I'm about to explain with further details when he interrupts, shouting, "No, no, no, no." This is precisely the time when artists go to work. Not when everything is fine, but in times of dread, that's our job. I felt foolish the rest of that morning, especially when I recall the artists who had done their work in gulags, prison cells, hospital beds, who did their work while hounded, exiled, reviled, pilloried, and those who were executed. The list, which covers centuries, not just the last one, is long. A short sample will include Paul Robeson, Primo Levi, Ai Weiwei, Oscar Wilde, Pablo Picasso, Dashiell Hammett, Wole Soyinka, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Lillian Hellman, Salman Rushdie, Oda Mueller, Walter Benjamin, an exhaustive list that runs into the hundreds. Dictators and tyrants routinely begin their reigns and sustain their power with the deliberate and calculated destruction of art, the censorship and book burning of unpoliced prose, the harassment and detention of painters, journalists, poets, playwrights, novelists, and essayists.
And I see oceans.
This is the first step of a despot whose instinctive acts of malevolence are not simply mindless or evil, they are also perceptive. Such despots know very well that their strategy of repression will allow the real tools of oppressive power to flourish. Their plan is simple. 1, select a useful enemy and other to convert rage into conflict, even war. 2, Limit or erase the imagination that art provides, as well as the critical thinking of scholars and journalists. 3, distract with toys, dreams of loot, and themes of superior religion or defiant national pride that enshrines past hurts and humiliations. The nation could never have existed or flourished in 1940 Spain, or 2014 Syria, or apartheid South Africa, or 1930s Germany. And the reason is clear. It was born in the United States in 1865, the year of Lincoln's assassination, when political division was stark and lethal during, as my friend said, times of dread. But no prince or king or dictator could interfere successfully or forever in a country that seriously prized freedom of the press. This is not to say that there weren't elements that tried censure, but they could not over the long haul win. The nation, with its history of disruptive, probing, intelligent essays, sharing wide space equally with art criticism, reviews, poetry, and drama, is as crucial now as it has been for the past 150 years. In this contemporary world of violent protests, internecine war, cries for food and peace, in which the whole desert cities are thrown up to shelter the dispossessed, abandoned, terrified populations, run for their lives and the breath of their children, what are we, the so-called civilized, to do? The solutions gravitate towards military intervention and or internment, killing or jailing. Any gesture other than those two in this debased political climate is understood to be a sign of weakness. One wonders why the label weak has become the ultimate and unforgivable sin. Is it because we have become a nation so frightened of others, itself, and its citizens that it does not recognize true weakness, the cowardice, and the insistence on guns everywhere, war everywhere? How adult, how manly is it to shoot abortion doctors, school children, pedestrians, fleeing black teenagers? How strong, how powerful is the feeling of having a murderous weapon in the pocket, on the hip, in the glove compartment of your car? How leaderly is it to threaten war in foreign affairs simply out of habit, manufactured fear or national ego? And how pitiful. Pitiful because we know at some level of consciousness that the source and reason for our instilled aggression is not only fear, it is also money. The profit motive of the weapons industry, the financial support of the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about. Forcing a nation to use force is easy when the citizenry is rife with discontent, experiencing feelings of powerlessness that can easily be soothed by violence, and when the political discourse is shredded by an unreason and hatred so deep that vulgar abuse seems normal, disaffection rules. Our debates, for the most part, are examples unworthy of a playground. Name-calling, verbal slaps, gossip, giggles, all the while the swings and slides of government remain empty. For most of the last 5 centuries, Africa has been understood to be poor, desperately poor, in spite of the fact that it is outrageously rich in oil, gold, diamonds, precious metals, and other resources. But since those riches do not, in large part, belong to the people who live there and have lived there all their lives, it has remained in the mind of the West worthy of disdain, sorrow, and of course, pillage. We sometimes forget that colonialism was and is war, a war to control and own another country's resources, meaning money. We may also delude ourselves into thinking that our efforts to civilize or pacify other countries are not about money. Slavery was always about money. free labor producing money for owners and industries. The contemporary working poor and jobless poor are like the dormant riches of darkest colonial Africa, available for wage theft and property theft, and owned by metastasizing corporations, stifling dissident voices. None of this bodes well for the future. Still, I remember the shout of my friend that day after Christmas. No. This is precisely the time when artists go to work. There is no time for despair, no place for pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language, we do architecture. This is how civilizations heal. I know that the world is bruised and bleeding, and though it is important not to ignore its pain, it is also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. Like failure, chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge, even wisdom, like art. On a hot summer day in 1952, 17-year-old Mamie Livingston and two younger sisters walked the 10 blocks from their East Baltimore home to Clifton Park Municipal Swimming Pool. The three had never plunged into the pool, even though they grew up so very near to it. Mamie did not expect to enter the pool that day either, but she hoped. A rather rude attendant turned the girls away with scorn, according to Mamie, but added that the city would soon build a pool nearby that they could use. Mamie eagerly waited out the summer and her senior year at Carver High School, but saw no evidence of a new pool. Finally, in late July 1953, she wrote to the Afro-American, Baltimore's leading black newspaper, asking if they knew what happened to the pool for black swimmers. As of yet, she lamented, we have heard nothing more of this. At the end of the letter, Mamie linked the lack of an accessible municipal pool to the larger issue of civil rights. If this country is ever going to have equal rights, why not start here? For her, equal rights was not an abstract principle. It meant having a pool in which to swim, just like her white neighbors. Baltimore operated 7 outdoor pools at the time, 6 for whites, 1 for blacks. The whites-only pools were distributed throughout the city in Druid Hill, Patterson, Clifton, Gwynns Falls, Riverside, Roosevelt Parks. Most were resort pools with large tanks, concrete decks, and sand beaches or grassy lawns. In contrast, the city's only municipal pool for blacks, located in Druid Hill Park, was quite small, according to the Department of Recreation, and provided no leisurely space. Furthermore, Druid Hill Park was located several miles northwest of downtown and not easily accessible from East Baltimore, where many black families lived. Mamie's letter to the Afro-American prompted the paper to investigate the city's pool building plans and publicize the unequal provision. Shortly thereafter, 3 black boys drowned in 2 separate incidents while swimming in natural waters around the city. In one incident, Tommy Cummings and Bernard Hippings were swimming with 2 white friends in the Patapsco River when Tommy slipped beneath the water and never came back up alive. America's era of climate migration is here. This enormous migration will probably take place over a longer period than the Dust Bowl, but its implications are both profound and opaque. It will plunge the U.S. into an utterly alien reality. The closest analog could be the Great Migration, a period spanning a large portion of the 20th century when about 6 million black people departed the Jim Crow South for cities in the North, Midwest, and West. The Great Migration was out of the South into the industrialized North, whereas this is from every coastal place in the U.S. to every other place in the U.S. Not everyone can afford to move, however, so we could end up with trapped populations that would be in a downward spiral. Within just a few decades, hundreds of thousands of homes on U.S. coasts will be chronically flooded. Warming temperatures will fuel monstrous hurricanes like the devastating triumvirate of Irma, Maria, and Harvey in 2017, followed by Florence in 2018, that will scatter survivors in jarring, uncertain ways. 96,000. That's how many fewer African Americans are living in New Orleans now, more than 14 years after the storm. Nearly 1 in 3 black residents have not returned to the city after the storm. Katrina was not an equal opportunity storm. A black homeowner in New Orleans was more than 3 times as likely to have been flooded as a white homeowner. That wasn't due to bad luck, but because of racially discriminatory housing practices. The high ground was taken by the time banks started loaning money to African Americans who wanted to buy a home. Nor has New Orleans experienced an equal opportunity recovery, in no small part because the white civic leaders who openly advocated for a whiter, wealthier city. Amistad, an opera in 2 acts, music by Anthony Davis, libretto by Thulani Davis. Act 1, Scene 1, The Unknown is My Realm. The Spanish schooner Amistad out of Cuba drifts off Long Island. The ghost ship is legendary, taken over by slaves, haunting eastern waters. Aboard ship is one who shapes their fate, a ragged, boastful African deity. The trickster god Esu is the spirit of rebellion, uncertainty, and mischief. He is the god of the crossroads, mediating the human and the divine. When humans meet him, they are apt to lose their way, yet, ironically, he holds the key to their survival. This trickster has been led astray himself, and the torturous middle passage journey has nearly blinded him and weakened his powers. The trickster claims that yet he will prevail, but asks for help from the goddess of the waters. Scene 2, Cloth for the Dead. The trickster hears the ship's 2 hostages, a navigator and a slave, are scheming. They tie the helm on a northerly course, as they have every night. The African leader, Senke, discovers the trick and realizes they have not headed to Africa, but zigzagged towards another fate. When the ship runs aground, an enterprising seaman discovers them and seizes the ship to sell the Africans, who insist they are free. Senke believes they are the victims of a Mendu taboo. To see a god can bring danger. Antonio, a lifelong slave and witness to mutiny, has fears too. Scene 3, Savages of Legend. Newspaper reporters watch the captives being paraded to jail and joust over their lot. The reporters inflame the American course into a racist tirade, culminating in, "Give them liberty, we'll give them death." Setting foot on American soil seems to restore the god of chance and scares the Africans. Scene 4, Ankle and Wrist. As Americans gawk at the jailed captives, Margot tells of her capture, and the captives vow not to reveal where they are from and to protect their families. Senke recalls being in a net. A phrenologist measures the skulls of the Mende prisoners and renders his findings to the press. Scene 5, The Greatest Liberty. Abolitionist Tappan pleads with Adams to act as the lead lawyer for the Africans. The former president resists because he has not been on a court in years. He then muses on the young republic's vision of liberty. Act 2, Posers, Dandies, Hacks. The reporter introduces the cast at court. Scene 2, what the navigator saw. The navigator tells of waking to the touch of a blade. Scene 3, President's parlor, a foreign appeal. The president and the Spaniard plot to sneak the captives to Cuba if the Africans should win in court. Scene 4, what Antonio saw. Antonio recalls the captain's death. The court turns against the Africans. Scene 5, they saw a god. The captives say the story begins in Africa. Scene 6, skin of clouds. The goddess of waters invoked by their tale recalls the middle passage. Scene 7, freed by lord and chief. The captives describe how upon landing in Cuba, the seeds of revolt are now sown when Antonio rebukes the trickster and the cook threatens the captives. Antonio tells them that they are now in a new world. Scene 8, the rising. The trickster frees the captives and starts the revolt. Senke decides to spare Antonio. Scene 9, bird on the wing. Adams sums up before the court, and the judge renders his verdict. The captives' case is won. The trickster reveals to Senke his decision to stay in the Americas. The captives are free to return to Africa. Collection overview, Virginia Key Beach Park Trust Oral History. The Virginia Key Beach Park Trust Oral History Collection includes VHS tapes and DVDs containing interviews from activists and citizens who participated in or experienced the 1945 foundation of the segregated Virginia Key Beach and its current restoration through the Virginia Key Beach Park Trust. Interviewees discuss their personal beliefs, political activism, and current issues involving the restoration and preservation of the beach. Each person uniquely recounts their personal experiences and histories about the beach, including stories about relatives, friends, and detailed account, as well as a plan of action to implement a museum and a rejuvenated historical environment at Virginia Key as a cultural reminder of the past. Item 1, Enid Pinckney interview. Growing up in Miami, Pinckney enjoyed school at Booker T. Washington High School. The church, movies, clubs, and the beach constituted her and her friends' leisure activities. She often interacted with whites naturally, but was aware of the segregated nature of Miami. Some family friends lived in Miami Beach and were treated poorly. However, her friends and colleagues knew their rights and fought with hope. She participated in the Natives of Dade organization and was part of an integrated Methodist church. Pinckney discusses Father Culmer at the St. Agnes Episcopal Church, which began a civil voting rights movement. Pinckney recalls memories at Virginia Key Beach with their church for baptisms in the ocean water. They brought their own food and enjoyed the recreational activities on the beach. They had a sense of pride and ownership of their colored beach. Pinckney doesn't believe that the beach was simply a concession or a negative experience. It was a positive experience, with much to be gained from restoration to the previous state of the beach. Pinckney is an active historian, mentions the renowned Hampton House, a black-only hotel where Martin Luther King Jr. stayed. This hotel would be preserved by the Virginia Key Trust, Pinckney's organization. Greg Bush interview. Dr. Greg Bush, a restoration historian in charge of much of the political maneuvering and logistics of the restoration project, discusses the various environmental battles in Florida at the end of the 20th century. His environmental preservation efforts began in 1996 with the Urban Environment League, which battled against losses of natural spaces and urban environments in Miami. He details the battles and demonstrations of 1999's attempt to stop demolition and development in Miami. He worked against the committee intending to demolish Virginia Key Park. Later, he designed a charrette to help restore Virginia Key Beach, contacting advocates of of both civil rights and property preservation. He strategically created a coalition to preserve environment and history, using the press to get the news out. Virginia Key is a site of African religious and social life, but respect for the land is also important, considering the composite ideas of many people. It is an intergenerational area. The 1940s weighed in and established precedent for movements in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. It is now a struggle for public land, which is often neglected for commercial interests. Dr. Bush believes that decisions of what to do with Miami's public land should be up to the community rather than to a few developers. Oral histories push him to fight more for the beach's preservation. Edward Joseph Bryan. Bryan, born and raised in Miami, recalls the horrible living conditions during segregation. He and his friends would run to elementary school in order to escape the taunts of whites. His mother always emphasized the importance of education, and in 1946, Bryan went off to college in Washington. He did not return to Miami until 1956, after Virginia Key Beach was open. While in school, his mother wrote to him about members of the NAACP who planned an incident in May 1945 where they would go into the waters of Baker's Hollow. His mother, an NAACP treasurer, gave a lawyer enough money to bail them out of jail in case they were arrested. None of the 7 participants that waded in, however, were arrested after that incident. When he returned home, the beaches were always crowded and everyone enjoyed it. A bridge was built in 1947, and although most of the blacks did not have cars, they would wait for a large truck to drive them across the bridge. Everyone found a way to this important community meeting space. He wants the sacrifices of those 7 individuals to be remembered as the beach is restored. Item 18, M. Athalie Range, interview. Range's father worked in South Beach. As a young child, she faced the many elements of segregation against her parents. Her first experiences at the beach were for church picnics, where Range's family and friends had to travel north to the beach in a truck. Bear Cut was the first island in Dade County where blacks could swim. The island was not protected land. Range discusses an experience when, as a child, she was injured and her friends could not find help. In 1945, Virginia Key was established. The Memphis Press. 10 a.m. Brooks Memorial Art Library, Overton Park, where Thursday is Negro Day, and usually, according to directors, very few take advantage of it. 4 boys and 3 girls entered, asked to see the Mid-Atlantic exhibit, were directed to the basement where it is, and were standing there when the police were called. Those who got inside were charged with loitering, disturbing the peace, disorderly conduct, and threatening to breach the public peace. They were Darnell Thomas, 21, Gene Bonds, 24, Joe Iris Smith, 21, Virginia Owens, 23, Jesse E. Jones, 21, Ronald Anderson, 21, and Maddie M. Daniels, 24. Arrested outside and charged with loitering were Harold Ransom, 24, Johnny Naylor, 22, Vinnie Johnson, 21, Gene F. Brown, 25, Clary Avon, 21, and Steve Taylor, 21. Cover: an undated map of historic black areas in St. Petersburg known as Methodist Town, the Gas Plant District, Peppertown, Cooper's Quarters, and Jordan Park, along with their relationship to the historic 22nd Street South Business District. Although de facto segregation is known to have occurred in St. Petersburg as early as the end of the 19th century, the first attempt at de jure segregation took place during the 1913 election for city commissioner in the form of an all-white primary, which was widely used throughout much of the South at the time. To ensure that only whites and white candidates with a large following would appear on the final ballot, the purpose of the all-white primary was to prevent African Americans from voting during the primary election, thereby automatically eliminating candidates with a strong black following. In St. Petersburg, the rationale behind this decree was stated in the following words by the editor of the St. Petersburg Independent during the lead-up to the election. The Independent doesn't care a rap who the city officials are, just so as they are good and competent men and give the city a good administration. But it is interested in white people controlling the city affairs.
Whereas the all-white primary may have had some impact on the black community, the formal segregation laws that undoubtedly had the greatest impact was the one that dealt with racial zoning, which also appeared in the city charter in 1931 and remained in the charter following it in that form until it was removed in 1971. Segregation of races. To establish and set apart in said city separate residential limits or districts for whites and Negro residents. To designate, establish, and set apart the territorial limits or districts of said city within which white persons may reside, and separate territorial limits of districts within said city within which Negroes may reside. To prohibit any white person from taking up or establishing place of residence or business within the territorial limits of said city, so set apart and established for the residences of Negroes, and to prohibit any Negro from taking up or establishing a place of residence or business within the territorial limits of said city, so to set apart and establish for the residence of white persons. 22nd Avenue South in St. Petersburg is better known as the Deuces, a historic part of the city that kept a 1960s African-American community together. The historic Manhattan Casino is a landmark in the Deuces neighborhood, known for big jazz names like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Ray Charles, James Brown, Nat King Cole, and many others. It functioned as a community center for culture and entertainment in South St. Petersburg for more than 40 years. In 1962, one could step out of the door, cross the street, get a shoe shine at the Cozy Inn, have lunch at the Shag, and later get a haircut at Oscar Klecky's. You could visit your attorney and buy groceries at Barco's store. Dr. Eyre could examine you, and if it was too late for that, funeral arrangements could be made at the Arch Royale. However, in time, the area lost its spark. You can ask someone like Gloria Campbell, who has kept her business there for the past 2 decades, about the change. Segregation and the interstate basically killed this area. Ralph Ellison defines jazz as an impulse, as a constant process of redefinition. The jazz artist constantly reworks her identity on 3 levels. 1, as an individual. 2, as a member of a community. 3, as a link in the chain of tradition. Nothing is ever a given. Who you are, the people you live with and for, the culture you bear, everything remains open to question, probing, and reevaluation.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Mario and Jonathan and Thuto, who's an alum from the CCCP program. It's really wonderful. I think first I love the kind of space-time introduction as a kind of fundamentals of architecture and as a kind of connection between architecture and performance, and the fact that both architecture and performance kind of deal with those dimensions in different ways, and the movement of the body and how the body connects the two together. And I kept thinking in relation to your body up in the courtyard of our dream of connecting this space through the library into the courtyard and how we just haven't been able to figure it out, and yet through the moment, this kind of performance, you were able to make that connection between outside and inside in section, and it was just a kind of beautiful sort of moment. And it seemed that in some ways, maybe it kind of demonstrated the limits of how we think about architecture, or the limits of architecture, and in addressing, I think earlier today at Open House there was a question of how architecture addresses its responsibility, and the kind of sort of collage that you had, the montages between colonialism and, when you spoke about that, and architecture, questions of race and power and the environment, and migration and forced migration through the centuries, and forced migrations to come, and these connections that we do have a hard time making through architecture. And tonight you made it through performance and filmmaking and music, and kind of opened up the parts in a way, and assembled them in a new way. And that is what architecture to a certain extent is taking the parts and assembling them in new ways. And then you started to show your own work, and you could see that in your work and in your drawings, and the kind of where you still read the parts, but they're assembled in kind of new ways. And I, of course, also was thinking about the work of Bernard Tschumi, and I know he had a strong influence. I mean, as an architect, you're obviously looking at artists, but this kind of capturing emotion. And so maybe I wanted to start with this notion of parts, and thinking through the parts first, and your contribution, and the film as it stands on its own, and the performance, and then your work, and then how you've thought about bringing it all together, and through collaboration, opening up maybe new questions for both architecture, filmmaking, and performance together. So.
Well, in terms of the parts, I guess I've been thinking a lot about an essay that I recently read by Tina Campt called Practicing Refusal. And this is a concept that Tina, who used to be at Barnard, who's now at Brown, and Saidiya Hartman, and they formed the Refusing Collective, Practicing Refusal Collective, of which Mabel is a member of the collective. But this idea of practicing refusal, and Tina writes about artists who use, let's say, radical modalities of visuality to refuse the systems of visuality that exclude blackness. So for me, I was thinking about the ways in which architecture has been complicit in certain regimes of power, and how to construct a different mode of presenting a lecture, but a different mode of representation. So yes, there were some plans and drawings in there, but in terms of let's say, setting the table and representing a larger set of architectural ideas, I wanted to experiment with, okay, how can we perform it? But then there is the spoken word, which has to do with space-time, black holes, coloniality, the art, and also I was looking at Arthur Jafa's work, the Apex, which there was a little bit of that in there. So, thinking about a kind of radical form of presentation in terms of these parts, and of this work.
Mario approached me, and I was very surprised and loved the opportunity. And I think the first provocation was to think about the title that you had offered, which we were thinking through together, but water as a kind of conceptual gesture. And there were so many things that I think in translation couldn't be translated from different mediums and practice and expertise, but a lot of longing to somehow arrive at proximity in the process, which were through many trials. But I think to make a stance perhaps for where I'm coming from in the collaboration performatively, there feels like architecture is always situated in the body, like you're saying, the body is a certain kind of architecture, and in the training of training the body perhaps, both as in the practice of being a performance maker, but also all of us as bodies moving in space, we understand there's a certain kind of carriage, postures, of, notions of civility that erect the spine and create kind of ways that we are in proximity and our intimacy exists in social space. And that feels like an alliteration on the architecture in the space. What happens when a body is in space? And I guess in my practice, normally that happens in a theater space or perhaps a non-traditional space, and I have to think about how to activate that space or how to be activated by it, or how memory presides in land and space, which when we arrived here became pretty interesting because the well upstairs, which is a class offering, is actually decaying. It's just like an object that is decaying and falling apart, but it has such significance actually in terms of all the memorabilia around it, but inside of it is just wreckage. It has leftovers from Black and Milds and kind of wrappers and just trash and residue, and at the same time it's this kind of plaza or this platz, like this place where people should commons together. And so the entanglement of me being there doing this perhaps obstructive act, you don't get in the recording, but a lot of people stop me and say to stop, or ask me if I'm hurt, or which to riff on the refusal, it's what happens when certain subjects are in certain places at a certain significant time. So that feels architectural also. That's choreographic, body, space, place.
Yeah, and Jonathan used the word entanglement. Mm-hmm. And I think for us, this was very much about entanglement and how I was thinking about constructing this, and the images. All of that was about the kind of entanglement of all of these disparate sort of things in terms of conditions of power.
Yeah, and elemental like water in terms of flow. Like there was like so much osmosis happening at the same time. Yeah.
I think all I would really add is that this project, as well as Mario offering it to me and being tremendously excited to work on it, I think coincided with the last year of mine at GSAPP and thinking more about theater and architecture, and sort of wishing that there was a more explicit class or study that goes on within the School of Architecture on choreography directly. And I think Jonathan's explained it really well, the way that choreography can be an act of refusal, can manipulate a public space, and there was a high degree of chance that was going on with this performance.
We couldn't see that. It felt very choreographed and
yeah, a degree of like watching him and moving expectantly with how he was moving, and thinking how it would play for everyone in the audience, and yeah.
So, is it still up? Yeah, the installation is still up, and is it staying for a while, or?
Yeah, it could stay forever if you like.
Oh yeah, let's do that. Let's make an announcement then. And I was curious because we didn't see it. What was the reaction of some of the people, or did you?
Yeah, I think it mimics the kind of reactions that happen, like if we were just 2 blocks away from Columbia University, so like it's the same parallel. Someone came out of their class in Fayweather, I believe is what the building's called, and said, we're having a class and we can't concentrate with you doing this. And which is all really potent, because that's the reason I chose that location and site. And also that there's a drone, there's a kind of dulling, annoying, inundating, perhaps it'll harm your ears in a few years, I'm sorry, but the act of also being a nuisance perhaps happened even when I was attempting to be quiet. But now, I was unrolling fabric, but it created an obstruction.
A lot of questions, but I want to make sure the audience has a chance. So maybe one last question is, how has that transformed how you think about architecture, performance, and filmmaking, or kind of what has it opened up? Or because obviously it's entangled, and so do you dissent tangle it and take something new, or for all three of you?
Well, I think one question is the question of representation and visuality. So to think about the forms of representation in terms of what we design and in terms of what we do in the studio. And so this semester in housing, we've actually been talking about architecture and performance, and we've had a performance artist who might be somewhere here in the audience tonight, sort of come and work with the students and to think about domesticity, particularly in housing, as performance. So that's one way, and also it does kind of, I think, lead from this idea that architecture is an event, or is constructed from events, and rather than thinking of program as being static, to think of architecture as being constructed of a series of events. And so that's a discussion that I saw some of my students out there that we've been having this semester.
It feels really affirming. I'm sorry. It just feels really affirming, yeah, to be in proximity, to see different ways that this is being approached. I think it's not a zeitgeist, but this has been long-time work that everyone is involved in who is thinking radically along this praxis. So it's both inside the academy and outside, and this is affirming that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I should. For me, I didn't come to GSAPP with an architectural background, and I think there's again, this sense of like collision that's happening between Jonathan's performance and the university, as well as the pedestrians. And my background is mainly in video, and I think there is a real tension between purely representation as progress, let's say, in nonfiction filmmaking, and any kind of like material, physical progression, social progression that comes along with representation. And I think in a way, the sort of act of filming Jonathan added to a certain disruption of the space, the fact that it was sanctioned, but also, again, highly variable as to how people would react to it, was for me a really encouraging way to think about public space, recording public space.
I wanted to ask about the music also. Is that who or how was the music assembled, or is that you?
That was me.
Oh, amazing. Thank you, Mario. I didn't know you were also a musician or a DJ, but that was really, really nice. Anyway, I should open it up. Thank you for colonizing the courtyard for us, making us visible to the university.
I wish I could.
Let's keep it for a while.
Watching your work and also looking at the title, I'm sort of curious about what or how water is a tool or an architectural tool or force in your minds. How does water work architecturally? I feel like I was getting some of that from the piece, but I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on that.
I think in conceptualizing the piece, and this actually extends back to my spring studio, so I'll keep bringing this back to teaching. My spring last year studio, which was a project on water, so the students design projects off of, some were actually in water in Cape Verde, and some were sort of in the desert, but the studio was called The Space of Water. And so we were looking at the topological and cultural conditions of water, particularly as Cape Verde was an important stop along the transatlantic slave trade between Africa and North America, but also between Europe and South America. As I mentioned, there was a piece in the spoken word from the 1619 project that began tonight with, they say our people were born on water. So I was really thinking about water as a
foundational or let's say ontological, water and being, actually, which then sort of leads me back to Christina Sharp's book, In the Wake, on blackness and being. So, and what she sort of terms these various ways of thinking about sort of the wake, sort of being in the wake of the ship, the wake as watching over the dead, the wake as in terms of consciousness. So water, in the conceptualization of this piece, and also, in the research that we were doing in the studio last spring, was really, again, thinking about water in terms of being, as a kind of foundation for architecture, if you will.
Thank you for your shared performance. I don't have a fully formulated question, but I'll try to ask a clear question. I'm interested in seeing if there's some way you all could elaborate on the decision to split your performance space in two, to have a at least partially bifurcated performance in relation to maybe some idea of water and density flow. Because for me, somehow the earlier part of the performance seemed to have focus a lot on some idea of the flow of dense information, and specifically the idea of an individual body trying to find its way through information on the internet. So I guess I'm wondering what it would have been like if, for example, we were all outside with the other part of the performance for a period of time, or if the performance that was outside was inside more of the time, if materials from the outside came inside, or maybe even in terms of density flows, how important was it for the three of you that there was an inside and outside, that we had the opportunity to flow in and out of, but generally chose not to, at least with our bodies?
I feel like this also adds to the last question, but I think this came up when we were speaking a few times over the phone and kind of collaborated a lot of language when I was trying to make sense of what my side was in this. But the notion of being in the hold kept on coming up, and so you're nodding your head, so I'm guessing you got, so the remaining inside of the ship, or the significance of the afterlives of slavery, that is recognized in the work you're saying, Christina Sharp's, but also the situation of water as being either in the water or not in the water, being in the ship, being taken overboard into the water, felt very significant to be inside or outside of that experience, and to be carrying whatever that means to be in the afterlives of that significant event. Which means also like being inside of this theatrical space in which you are receiving a recitation that languages very clearly perhaps some cartography of events, and then outside there's a camera that's surveilling me, that it's a surveillance device. It's seeing me from the bird's eye view, and it's consuming me in the same way that, for instance, when you say someone following the internet is in the process of consumption and kind of mass information dwelling, and then there's a subject that's also being perhaps seen from different angles, perceived, and you can't tell perhaps which aspect is live or which part is just another part of the compilation in which Mario's composed. And that kind of trickery feels like interesting towards a performative quality when then a body does arrive, perhaps, and that body can somehow be embodied. It could somehow be just whatever. It can be a figment, but it plays with actuality.
Yeah, and it was also important in putting the piece together, that, to get to your question, that Jonathan sort of moved from outside to inside, so that there was this sort of transfer. So you may not have noticed, but that part of the performance actually started at the door there, and he sort of slowly came down. So similar to water coming down the steps. So that was the link that we were trying to make. And in terms of the images, I would say not so much concerned about the internet, but thinking about migration and movement and flow. But the images were about establishing, let's say, the complexities of blackness in terms of then the questions that the projects wanted to get at, or the architectural examples wanted to get at in the latter part of the presentation. Okay, hard question.
No, I just wanted to thank you three for a really absolutely phenomenal presentation. And having been in this room, I don't know, hundreds of times over the course of 30 years, I can. This was like the blackest I've ever seen in this space. I mean, I'll be perfectly honest, and it made me realize also just how white my education in architecture actually has been. Because I understood all of those images and references, and I understand, but I also had to kind of learn the language of architecture, which is fairly white. I mean, it's a discipline of whiteness. So I was curious in terms of the ways in which blackness is being rendered as water. And I love Catherine McKittrick, the geographer, who says that black people have a history of either being displaced, right, itinerant and moving, or placed. And buildings don't like water, right, water damage. So I'm wondering, like, in your mind, like, how is blackness filtrating or infiltrating into the whiteness of architecture?
You
can answer poetically.
Okay, well, let me start by saying that, I mean, for me it was important to think about, as I mentioned in response to Amal's first question, to think about the ways in which architecture has been complicit in certain sort of regimes of power, which have primarily been exclusionary in terms of the representation of blackness, but also in terms of black bodies. And I'm not so much interested in the other, but that, in terms of subjectivity, but that there are subjectivities other than whiteness, if you will. I mean, we're taught, and this is perhaps one of the reasons in classic architectural photographs we never see people, is because it's assumed that we all know who the subject is, right? And that subject is a universal subject, but not really. I mean, it's this guy, right? It's the Vitruvian. I mean, that's like one of the first things we learn in architectural history. We learn about, Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. Or it might be this guy, the modular. But, but what about blackness in terms of labor, in terms of the hidden presences? There is and Mabel, you know this, there is this 1940s article that Philip Johnson made of the Glass House that was published in the Architectural Review, where there are only two photographs of the interior with people in them. One is of Johnson sitting at his desk with his back to the camera, and the other is of the kitchen bar, the abstract bar. It has all the accoutrements to signify that it's kitchen, sort of tea set, dishes, what have you, that he's put on top. But he's also placed a black butler standing behind it. That's a kind of rare photograph. You never really see, a photograph of people there, but there was some labor there. There was someone who was maintaining, if you will, helping to maintain the status of modernism. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to, I would say, exorcise, if you will. Exercise that and reveal that in terms of architecture.
Thank you very much. I think so many things were brought up, so just to zero in on one question. So the introduction of time into your performance was really exciting to think that this is happening now, and the performance, just thinking of presentation, representation, how we experience buildings. Everyone here was participating. So thinking of how there's afterlife of this, it's not so easily reproduced. I guess if you could problematize or just expand on how you think this, you're stepping outside of mediums, where you intend to have kind of control or authorship over the reproduction of this, how I plan to look at the recording it again, but that's not quite the same. And so how our participation in the performance is kind of vital, and what the kind of packaging of this might look like for people who weren't here or might want to experience, rewind back into the performance?
I don't know, and I mean, you guys were here. That's important. Those who weren't, you know, they missed it. But for me, I think there's a lot that's happening outside of this building right now. I mean, you know, there was this amazing Saturday at the Guggenheim with Tina Campt, Sadia Hartman, I think Christina Sharp, and Simone Lee. I mean, you know, about Simone Lee's work, but it was more, you know, these 4 super intelligent black women discussing art and race and cultural production. Theaster Gates had the Black Artist Retreat at the Armory last week. A year, maybe it was 2 years ago, Carrie Mae Weems had an all-day event called A History of Violence at the Armory that just brought together these amazing sort of thinkers, creatives, and really part of this for me was trying to bring something to the larger discourse that's happening outside of here, which rarely includes architecture, actually. It rarely includes architecture. Yeah.
We're always 15 years late. So.
Yeah. So if I can do whatever to kind of bring architecture to that, bring that to here, that's kind of what I'm interested in. So in terms of the life of this thing, I mean, I hope that something of what was discussed here, something of what you saw, you have a conversation with someone outside of here, and like the entanglements which are happening here, we make some connections beyond this space. And I'd like to get Christina Sharp here. I'm trying to get her on my review, but I'd like to get her in this building, for example.
You used the word labor, and I thought that was a really important part of the performance, partly kind of seeing this juxtaposition, of the sort of barrage of images of these kind of works, let's say, that kind of crystallize a certain intensity, and then juxtaposed with Jonathan outside kind of doing the work, and then the sort of again, the juxtaposition of your kind of sweaty body coming in here, and that's both joyful and belabored simultaneously. And so I was wondering if you could just talk about, in your practice, the kind of birth, maybe both the crystallization of the final work, but also both the burden and the joy of having to do the work. And by doing the work, I mean that in a broader sense.
Yeah. Let's see. I mean, this is also part of my practice now, or sort of has evolved into my practice, and probably because I've been sort of keeping my eye on artists for I don't know how many years now, and in dialogue with them and invited to collaborate, and so that is actually where a lot of the joy is. And then there is, I feel like, part of professional practice is, I think there's a distinction between labor and work. So for me, work, there's a certain enjoyment, I guess, with sort of work. With labor, sometimes not, or sometimes one doesn't have a choice in terms of labor. But I also think of work as being generative, I suppose, whereas labor, one might be generating something, but maybe there's a predictable outcome, or one is generating something for someone else or for some other purpose, whereas work is perhaps ongoing, and generative.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.